was thinking about which kind of section of research to present today, I kind of ended up somewhere in between the Ryman project that, as Jeffrey mentioned, in some ways I'm done with, but I keep coming back to. It still is informing a lot of what I'm doing, and I'll try to explain how that is. And this new project on the kind of therapeutic basis of American modernism. And so I want to just kind of say three things that I was thinking of that maybe the Ryman example helps us, certainly not to clarify, but maybe to problematize productively. One, the monochrome as something that is the result of someone who is self-taught. I think we typically think of, and I hate these words like vernacular or outside or whatever, as being the kind of purview of the representational or figurative artist. And so what does it mean for it to actually happen in abstraction? Also, one of the things that Ryman unsettles is this kind of idea of the outsider at all, precisely because, and I'll go through this in some detail in just a few minutes, he actually is not outside at all. He might be self-taught, which he was. He's an autodidact when it comes to visual art making and painting specifically, but his introduction to art practice happened within the institution of the Museum of Modern Art. So he's absolutely not working outside of a kind of awareness of the traditions of modernism at the time, both of their production and institutionalization. And then finally, what does it mean to actually think about the museum as a site of pedagogy? And that's something that I think also is incredibly germane to many conversations today. And I want to maybe, before I get into kind of all of this, to give you a little bit of a sense of how these two projects, which I think when I kind of tell people what I'm working on now, if they know that I've worked on Ryman before, there's a kind of like ellipsis in how does that connection happen. So I wanted to kind of explain that a little bit because I think it really gets to what you're trying to do here today, and actually the exhibitions on view, I think, kind of bridge this in really interesting ways as well. So the new book that I'm working on, and I'm going to stick a little bit more to the script because I would just talk like forever and you don't want me to. Okay, so Better for the Making is a historical treatment of the social importance of art, in which I attempt to answer a straightforward but elusive inquiry, at least elusive thus far to me, which is when and under what circumstances did people in America come to believe that making art was good for them? I begin with the period following the Civil War, when William James's psychology and pragmatist philosophy offered a means of coping with the radical contingencies of modern life. Through the settlement house movement, among others, other people and practitioners quickly put such ideas to use relative to the making of objects. While a literature on the development of 19th century notions of rehabilitative craft exists, no one that I've encountered, at least thus far, has claimed that this appealed to process, which I define as making something without anticipating or requiring an artwork to serve as the apotheosis of one's engagement with materials and creation, is foundational to certain tenets of American visual modernism, which is to say that I don't want to keep it apart kind of as a craft tradition or an outsider tradition or as a therapeutic tradition, even though I believe that's actually where it starts. But I actually think it becomes absolutely critical to our understanding of the turning of process into the category of process art in the 1960s. So part of my argument actually consists of thinking about Robert Morris's nomination of this in 1967, 68, as actually at that point naming a tendency that at that point is about a century old. I then, in this new project, Better for the Making, ask how these ideas of process as something that came to be privileged through a self-conscious exploration of materials and techniques for their own sake inflected the making, viewing, and teaching of art in a range of settings in the post-war period. Through these cases, a central claim of Better for the Making is that vanguard artistic practice in post-war America develops from therapeutic practice. Okay, so far so good. Again, the question is, how did I get there from Ryman? In fact, surprisingly directly, although it was something that I didn't see for a really long time. But what I started to wonder was, on the one hand, what would have happened had Ryman been educated in the ways that he was in the museum, which again I'll come to in just a moment, and not actually become a visual artist. He was absolutely exceptional, almost singular in this regard. The pedagogical programs in which he was involved were not at all for the kind of professionalization of artists, but instead had very other kinds of agendas, which I will also go into. But also, what does it mean for these programs to have been developed in the context of World War II? So in fact, the art programs that he was experiencing, and in fact had his only kind of formal art training in, were developed specifically for the needs of veterans at MoMA in the 1940s. And so that, I think, casts a very long shadow in ways that we have yet to kind of fully come to terms with. So this kind of gets me in some ways to the beginning of Ryman, and then we'll circle back to a number of these issues. So Ryman was born in 1930 in Nashville, Tennessee. He attended the Tennessee Polytechnic Institute, where he studied music, and also at the George Peabody College for Teachers. In 1950, he enlisted and joined the Army Reserve Corps Band, where he played the tenor saxophone and briefly toured the southern United States during the Korean War. When released from duty in 1952, he took his meager payout, boarded a bus, and moved to New York City with the sole intention of studying and playing jazz. But by 1953, the nearly broke saxophonist had taken a temporary job as a vacation relief guard at the Museum of Modern Art, a job that allowed him to practice his instrument in the empty museum auditorium, and which, for exceedingly disparate reasons, he would hold for the next 7 years. During this time, Ryman confronted the story of modern painting as assembled and narrated by Alfred Barr, who we've heard already about today. Inspired by quotidian contact with the works of Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, and so many others, not to mention the contemporary canvases of the likes of Pollock, de Kooning, and Gottlieb that were entering the newly permanent collection in rapid succession and being highlighted in Dorothy Miller's Watershed American shows, Ryman was prompted to visit an art supply store himself. Self-taught, he began to paint and to use his time in the museum galleries to sketch, often on letterhead pilfered from staff offices. And you see an example of this here. And what's incredibly interesting about this kind of cache of these papers that survive is that some of them bear some resemblance to the works of art that were on view as he was standing there during his shifts, but a lot of them actually don't. And as time goes on, he really starts experimenting even with the kind of viscosity of the pens and the materials that he's using. He starts to use the paper as a kind of physicalized support, kind of in some cases as something bleeds through to, like the other side of the paper, he'll recuperate that as a kind of aesthetic incident. And so these are, I think, strategies that we come to see in his paintings thereafter. But this was absolutely a kind of pragmatic adaptation to circumstances and the kind of pilfering of office supplies. And I was actually thinking of it in relation to Continuous Project and kind of Diacrew much later, but kind of making use of what's available to you as you're working. Okay, so by 1954, Ryman had altogether abandoned his hopes for a musical career. So I think this brings us to the question, besides the works on view in the galleries, because they weren't necessarily contributing directly to the work that he started to make, what in fact not only precipitated this conversion, but gave him a kind of framework for what he started doing in paint. How, that is to say, did Ryman learn to paint, and what does this education suggest about the works that he produced thereafter? In 1953 then, not long into his tenure as a guard, Ryman was enticed by his staff discount to take an adult course in experimental painting at the People's Art Center in MoMA's Department of Education. This brief engagement provided his only formal art education, excluding a mechanical drawing class at the American Art School that he dropped almost as soon as he enrolled. Thus, while Ryman has come to assume a privileged position in post-war painting, and within the debates around abstraction particularly, he is an autodidact from within the institution. And let me say too, what's interesting, and you can see that even here, unlike a lot of the other abstract artists of this generation who were kind of formed through the crucible of figuration because of classes like the one that he briefly enrolled in and then dropped out of, or even somebody like Agnes Martin, who painted portraits, who painted landscapes. She would go on to destroy decades worth of production to kind of excise this from her kind of legacy, although she wasn't able to do that totally. But Ryman actually from the first started as an abstract artist. So he didn't actually pass through a kind of phase of emulation, whether of extant artworks, kind of like this idea of painting in the Louvre or painting in the institution, kind of copying the old masters, but neither did he draw from life, and nor did he ever feel that this was a phase that somehow needed to be kind of passed through on the way to abstraction. For him, abstraction was the kind of fundamental ground from which his work was to begin. He, I think, in so many ways, then this may be chief among them, was exceptional within this context of the People's Art Center. Most of the other participants sought not professional training, but relaxation, stimulation, and education about modern art through a curriculum developed in the context of the war effort. Indeed, the People's Art Center emerged in 1948, just a few years before Ryman encountered it, from the War Veterans Art Center, and it, in this passage, remained relatively unchanged except in its name and the population that it was intended to serve. So, I mean, the very kind of crass distinction here would be from soldiers to civilians after the wartime needs were being met by other institutions. Ryman's outcome was thus exceptional rather than exemplary, assimilating technical competence over time and querying the fundaments of the medium as his process and, I would argue, its nominal subject. Even so, I would also suggest that this case study reveals a more ubiquitous move from the therapeutic to the vanguard within the institutions and discourses of American modernism. And again, I think these are the kind of moments of conversion of the therapeutic to the vanguard that I'm particularly interested in for this new project, kind of places where the origins of certain practices, certain pedagogical intentions and so on, the kind of footprint of them remains, the name changes, and we kind of forget why they were developed in the first place and with what kind of end they were imagined to serve. Well, most of his peers enrolled in the Art Students League or in other school programs, thanks in large part to the new GI Bill and the advancing preeminence of the post-war MFA degree. Ryman shunned formalized education in favor of another sort of indoctrination. For him, art was less a profession to be assumed, or even a set of preordained skills to be studied, reproduced, and mastered, than a site of creative experimentation where materials could be tested. Ryman, as he has always maintained, wanted to see, quote unquote, how paint worked. He dates his first, let's see, oh, sorry, that's out of order, so I'm gonna have to come back to that, I'm sorry about that. He dated his first, well, I'll come back to that while we're here, so we don't have to go back. So this is just to show you, this is one of these archival documents relating to the creation of the Center for War Veterans. And it's amazing because, I'm realizing even with the better technology here and the better kind of screen for light, it still is maybe a little bit illegible for you. So let me just highlight a couple aspects. Talking about, says in the second paragraph, the enlarged quarters of the Veterans Art Center just opened. The museum has free day and evening classes in sculpture and ceramics, drawing and painting, woodworking design, jewelry, metalwork, book illustration, wood, engraving, graphic arts, silk screen printing, lettering, layout and typography, and weaving. And this is something that I will come back to, but this question of kind of painting among so many other possible vocations within this kind of curriculum, and we'll come back to that. So this is the painting that Ryman deems to be his first mature effort, which is from 1955, and then he came back to it many years later because his brother put it above a radiator and paint flecked off, and then he had to repaint certain aspects of it. But this is just, as you can see, a couple years into his tenure at MoMA. But the very first painting that he ever made actually was this one from the first year that I just mentioned. And so let me read you what he had to say about this. There was a little art supply store on the corner at 60th Street and Lexington Avenue, which was near his apartment. He actually lived right by Bloomingdale's, for those of you familiar with the Upper East Side. He says, I went there and bought a couple of canvas boards and some oil paint. They didn't have acrylic paint at the time, and some brushes, and I thought I would try to see what would happen. I wanted to see what the paint would do, how the brushes would work. That was the first step. I just played around. I had nothing really in mind to paint. I was just finding out how the paint worked, colors, thick and thin, the brushes, surfaces. So what's interesting about this, of course, is that there's no kind of deliberate end, and I'll talk more about this idea of his kind of remaining an autodidact in a way that I theorized through Dewey. But I think you can see here how he's experimenting actually with a lot of colors, and I'm sorry this looks a little bit more kind of all over. Can't totally tell what it looks like from your perspective, but it's a very kind of vivid murkiness. It's like pea soup or something, so that you can see that he's trying different colors and that they become all kind of muddled. And it's really, I mean, it's not a totally successful painting, let's say, but a lot of people, I think, are surprised by these early ones because the work for which he becomes significantly better known and which he continues to paint to the present involves different whites. And so one way we might think about it is that as this, what he calls his orange painting, involves different kinds of oranges and browns and reds that kind of bring these various hues to the pitch of visibility, so too the whites. Also, he thinks very directly about the grounds as a kind of reciprocal kind of situation against which whatever pigment he puts upon it will then register somewhat differently. So thus, although his earliest paintings evidence palettes that run the gamut from saturated colors, primaries, browns, greens, and oranges are omnipresent, to dim pastels, by a few years later he was restricting his options. He turned to significant portions of white around this year, 1959, after which time many untitled works still betray vivid grounds, and we can see that a little bit here in the green, kind of in the midsection, you'll see orange at the center. And he would continue this also with pinks and reds and golds. So he began using the richly saturated paint, but I think the problem was that he couldn't actually see very well because of the kind of distractions of mixing the colors, what the individual strokes were doing when they were applied. An orange mark on an opaque support asserted its presence to render both action and effect clearly perceptible, but only really when it wasn't already a ground totally of orange. So white became a way for him to, of course, restrict the palette, the better to see actually what the materiality of the paint was able to yield. Something that I think is a kind of misconception is that he never intended in the beginning not to reintroduce color subsequently to this kind of phase of his self-education, whereby he would have a better sense of, literally a thick or a thin brush, a kind of matte or a glossy paint. He was really trying to figure out how these materials worked and thought that once he had gained a kind of competence with these kind of basic or rudimentary material concerns, that he would be able to go back to questions of color and composition in a different way. But in fact, what ended up happening was that even within this radically reduced set of options or givens, it became infinitely expansive. And in fact, he was able to yield so much that he never felt the need to actually introduce color back in that way, which I think is a really important thing to kind of underline. So his experimentation with increasingly white paint and various support structures has constituted a practice marked by a careful, even methodical working over of the conventions of painting in their most radically reduced and yet paradoxically expanded possibilities. Through such a reduction, Ryman's paintings exhibit a way of making apart from representing, and he produces paintings as objects as much as images, or more exactly, as images without illusions. They open onto and often explicitly annex the light, space, and walls of the galleries in which they are cited as part of their compositions. And let me just show you a couple more so you have a kind of sense of what he was doing. In the early 60s, he played a lot with the kind of problem of the support. What would happen if a canvas was stretched versus unstretched? How would it buckle? How would the tension affect what had already been put on it? Or how would painting and then stretching it and then unstretching it, these kinds of material tensions, how that would actually affect the paint. He then, and maybe Alex, we can talk about this later in relation to Stella. Stella was a really important influence on him. He worked at MoMA through the 16 Americans exhibition in which Stella exhibited his black paintings, and that was a very formative thing. He was, there's lots of letters where he was trying to come up with enough money to buy one, and I forget how much it was. You might remember it was like nothing, a couple $100, but he didn't have enough money at that time to get one, and that was one of his regrets from this period. But he was very impressed by them at a time where it was a kind of huge debate within the institution whether this was something or nothing. But a couple years later, he would work on these Windsors where he too would kind of think about the support as dictating the terms of what would happen compositionally within, in this case moving top to bottom, left to right, each kind of row being articulated through the placement of paint, drawing the paint across the surface with the brush until it wore out, and then he would start again. But he would also, over the years, start thinking a lot about not just the stretcher, but where does the stretcher end? How is the stretcher affixed to the wall? Sometimes bringing brackets and kind of mechanisms of hanging from the undersides of canvases around to the front. In other cases, questioning, I think, so fundamentally the conventions of the medium as to end up with works like this, which for him, I think other people could have thought that this entered into a dialogue with sculpture, but for him, this remained absolutely within painting, but questioning why it is as a kind of convention within the history of Western art. Why does a painting need to be hung kind of flush to a wall? What would happen if it were to extend out from it? How would it then need to be supported? The bracketing would have to be different. The shadows that it cast would, of course, fall very differently and again be incorporated into the situation produced by that painting in a different way, but one that he didn't think was somehow categorically impossible within painting proper. And this is just to show you a kind of installation situation. And you can see, because I think sometimes, especially as he's been kind of satirized in the popular press by people like Morley Safer and others over the years, this kind of idea that like, oh, they're all the same, they're just white painting, white painting, white painting. But in fact, they're absolutely not. And I think when you see them, whether it's at Beacon or in Europe, like Schaffhausen is amazing, there are certain collections where you can see them in density and kind of in proliferation, and you realize actually how specific the solutions are for each and every composition. I think I have one more. So even to think about the incorporation of the wall, and maybe this is something we can come back to later as well, kind of translucent supports or painting directly on the surface as well. So through all of this, Ryman tested constitutive materials, querying technical strategies, and observing the ways that paint moves across a support. His approach to painting then was not contingent, as I was trying to articulate before, on an academic calendar, but tendered through shifting arrangements of pictures, which eventually, instead of being the ones at MoMA, became his own. And so here I'm showing you a wall that was in place in his studio for a great many years, is no longer. But what he would do is he would photograph and create this kind of ongoing archive of every painting that he'd ever done in black and white, which of course is kind of ironic because you lose all the subtleties. So in some ways, they're these kind of ghost stand-ins for paintings that absolutely require engagement in person, which gets back to some of these questions of phenomenology and affect and a kind of bodily orientation. But they were kind of mnemonic cues for him, as well as a kind of filing system for him to be able to remember what he had done and try not to repeat it. I think this is interesting too because it kind of gets to these questions of display, and this has already been broached a little bit earlier in a couple of the talks, this question of the archive or what exists as a result of something that is process-based, and how we kind of analyze the archive around the work as well. What I think is interesting about this, though, is that it was something that he returned to and that was constructive for him for the production of new works out of it. Thus, I think it belies a connection to an ethos of modernist self-discovery through materials and their consolidations as forms, whereas Howard Singerman has written in relation to the Bauhaus and to Dewey's role in it more precisely, quote, each formal discovery was a self-discovery. This is why modernism can be, or rather has been, simultaneously formalist and expressionist, because formal innovation is a discovering and instantiation of the self. But particular to Ryman's alignment of his practice with materials is the congruency between this mode of formal and subjective discovery and its practical confirmation within the Museum of Art program from the 1950s. Thus, if artists elsewhere were being indoctrinated, as Singerman argues, artists were teaching artists a particular métier or material tradition. I'm sorry, they were not teaching artists about a particular métier or material tradition, but about it along its frame. Ryman was being educated by objects and through the ways in which they were configured, installed, archived, presented, and so on. Thomas Crow has written that Ryman's concerns, quote, depended on the newly authoritative history of 20th century painting, which the MoMA had done the most to create. And, like any story promulgated by a museum, it will entail the necessary fiction that works of art generate other works of art with little mediation of historical context, which cannot be displayed on its walls. Crow continues, quote, Ryman made his art out of the same assumption. He would form a valid project through the consumption of certain ideas about what mattered in recent practice, while forgoing anything like a traditional apprenticeship in the production of paintings. And this, I think, really nicely kind of follows some of the things that you were just talking about, Alex. To be sure, working in the galleries from 1953 to 1960 proved adventitious to and determinant of Ryman's education in ways that he could not have foreseen. But even before his hire, Ryman had recently moved to New York, where he was visiting galleries and museums, in his words, quote, like a tourist. At MoMA, he, quote, looked at the collection. I was completely open to everything because I didn't know anything. I was totally naive, and so I just looked and looked. Soon, though, in the context of the employment, he was scheduling periodic looking blocks in front of a rotating cast of artworks. And I guess it's not that he was scheduling so much as he was being scheduled, and so maybe the agency there shifts. An argument can be made that Ryman's evolution from tourist to student, coincident with his conversion from musician to painter, had much to do with the museum's culture in the 1950s. The accessibility of and usefulness of its objects helped viewers to see creatively, think independently, gain knowledge of the manual crafts that are necessary to complete a work of art for oneself, and even to integrate the production and consumption of art into everyday life. Or so was the ambition of Victor DAmico, the director of the education department for over 3 decades, and the head of the People's Art Center. Let me come to this. So I guess a big part of my argument, just to kind of flag this, is that on the one hand, I think these things that he was coming to were very directly implicated in his being stationed within the galleries and kind of seeing what was happening curatorially and even in terms of didactic materials within the context of an installation. But so too, this kind of culture of pedagogy, both within the context of the People's Art Center and the way that it actually was shaping what was happening in the galleries, is a really important kind of missed link here. So DAmico was disdainful of what he called, he hated coloring books because he thought they encouraged, quote, neatness and imitative discipline at the expense of expression. He likened copying to counterfeiting or stealing. So for him, these older models of emulation of extant tradition, that was just absolutely a kind of failed enterprise from the beginning. His opinions were published in museum publications, many during these years, both during Ryman's employment, but also, of course, in the decade leading up to it, through the context of the war and the kind of manuals that were being developed in the context of the War Veterans Center. All of this was made possible by what I think maybe, and this is something we could talk about, maybe came in more fully actually not in the 30s when there was kind of lip service to this effect of participatory kind of involvement within the institution, but actually in the 40s and early 50s, where there was a lot of discussion internally within the museum about the 1929 State of New York Educational Charter, which declared that the mission of the institution was to create and educate a community of viewers, artists, and patrons for modern art. Barr curated installations with didactic wall texts, while DAmico's education programs translated John Dewey's ideas of creative education into a curriculum for art instruction. He highlighted the charter's pedagogical directives in the galleries, on the printed pages of museum publications, and through related programs, imaging the museum as a quote-unquote laboratory in which the community was encouraged to participate. And I think, and again, maybe this gets back to this conversation from earlier, I actually do think that the museum succeeded, at least for a time, which might feel very long past, in giving consequence to this rhetoric. So a score of contemporaneous publications included Creative Teaching in Art, which was first published in 1942 and was reprinted 7 times by 1951 and revised in 53 with a big rollout right as Ryman got to the museum, as well as the Art for Beginners series of books, which were inaugurated in the 40s, again in the context of the kind of veteran programs that really were keyed to these various aspects of kind of training within the institution that DAmico envisioned being useful for the returned servicemen. So they had titles like How to Make Objects Out of Wood, How to Draw and Paint, and so on. And these arts and crafts primers grew out of the museum's programs very directly. The series introduction, as reproduced in How to Make Modern Jewelry, states, quote, "The books are intended as self-instruction manuals for persons working on their own and as aids to the trained teacher in directing large groups." So in all of these instances, what's kind of amazing is that the projects begin with something appropriate for the novice. There's a lot of language around the veterans in particular about kind of meeting people where they are. They emphasize over and over again that there need be no prior experience working in whatever material they're coming to the museum to kind of practice. And then they proceed according to increased levels of difficulty with more tools kind of being added in the further one goes. So even something like jewelry making, which is the most utensil heavy, as you can imagine, stresses that most of its requirements are, quote, simple and not expensive with the exception of a blowtorch or a kiln for projects 13 and 14. So basically, as experience permits, complexity can kind of be introduced into these situations. Likewise telling is the one that you see here, Art for the Family, which demystifies art medium by medium. Quote, "For anyone who can hold a brush or work a pair of scissors or fasten things together or wants to." In a section called Everybody Can Paint, the authors, which is DAmico and his colleagues, explain that in addition to using paint, through painting you could, quote, "learn new and wonderful things about yourself and the world around you." So they detail which materials to buy, bristle brushes, a cellulose sponge, a water bowl, coffee cans, smock, where to buy them at local suppliers, and then what to do with them. So here's one of the, discover what you can do with paint. And if you see here along the edge, it says, dabbing one color over another, dry brush strokes, and so on. And at the risk of completely reducing this to the kind of visual typology of what Ryman would go on to produce, I also think it's important to kind of understand this as part of the formative context in which he began to work, where this kind of experimentation was licensed, a kind of very basic experimentation with the kind of tools of one's craft. So once a work has been produced, the authors propose staging a family art gallery where each person can learn from each other's works without actually copying from them. It says, don't copy anyone, anything, don't even copy nature. That way, the author suggests, you will nurture your own vision, and if you keep a record of what you can do, you can chart your own growth over time. So again, without making the analogy, between something like this incredibly pat, I fear kind of reducing it in this kind of comparison, but I also kind of want to, because these are precisely the kinds of connections that I feel have dropped out of a kind of post-war account of this material entirely. which is, I guess, to say it's the kind of didacticism in some way. But it was because notions of self-learning were flourishing within the museum to such an extent that the education department actually felt threatened by the kind of larger kind of ambition within other programs. The curatorial staff's assumption of the role traditionally associated with the education department, in fact, even precipitated a kind of crisis for DAmico about the educator's place in the museum. The quandary is evident in an article that DAmico wrote for the Museum of Modern Art Bulletin in 1951. There, he reiterated his mandate, but near the otherwise confirmatory text conclusion, he questioned his own department's efficacy. Never one to equivocate about his moorings in progressive education, DAmico did worry about whether this pedagogy could operate within the museum in the 1950s. Detailing the museum's commitment to art education under his tenure, from a pilot program conceived as the educational project in 1937 to its current status as a full-fledged department, DAmico traced a developmental narrative that paralleled the more general history of the museums. At the time that he wrote this article and was publishing materials like this, he wrote that, quote, there was a full-time staff of museum educators. They were actually reaching 50 New York City public schools every year with slideshow talks, teaching portfolios, texts, and lending libraries of art, reproductions from the museum's collections. The department operated, let me come ahead to this so you can see another example, a very popular young people's gallery, and I saw the kind of children's area here, and by 1951 had held 83 exhibitions of children's art, to come back to your point earlier, and almost annual children's holiday carnivals. The carnivals drew an average of 2,000 participants each year and operated on Dewey's principle that play could be instructive within an educative environment that stimulated the child through a canny intersection of the visual, the tactile, and the kinesthetic. And they would actually, during these years, go on to explore the realm of television and television broadcast through a program called Through the Enchanted Gate, which is a whole other kind of amazing subject, which I just don't have the time to go into. In addition to all this work for children, they were also sponsoring museum-conceived committees on art education and bringing in such kind of luminaries as Herbert Reed, Gropius, Mumford, Meyer Shapiro, Waldo Frank, on, as well as artists including Stuart Davis and Ed Reinhardt. But even so, given all this, DAmico was worrying between the successively fraught debates on educational reform that were playing out within the institution, which is to say, where was pedagogy supposed to be happening? In these carnivals or in the galleries? But also the equally vexed discourses, would say, on educational reform without during the kind of cultural shift to scientism under the Cold War. DAmico frequently worried that the proliferation of utilitarian agendas in a paranoid climate that was marked by, in his words, quote, a hysterical rush toward an overweighted science program would prove detrimental to the arts and to liberal education. And I think this is something that we would do well to kind of dwell on or revisit again in our own kind of current climate. There was also, though, the related concern of whether art museums could, in fact, provide an education. He reiterated that he thought it could, and he says, quote, the art museum has just begun to recognize its role in education. It is still pioneering as an instrument of education. With increased production of visual materials by the commercial firms, many of whom are exploiting the child rather than interested in his creative welfare, the museum, along with other educational institutions, has a tremendous challenge and responsibility to meet. So here he's framing it very directly in relation to the child and kind of primary education in America. And, it's, again, these debates I feel are very current. Again, what happens when art funding isn't there, in primary or secondary schools? And does the museum then have a different kind of social responsibility to be providing a kind of education that's actually not part of a kind of educational curriculum in public schools in this country? What is the kind of role of art in these places? But he was also thinking of it very directly in relation to adults. And so this is where I think he comes back both in alignment with and also kind of competition with Barr, who of course had his own ideas on this as well. But let me just show you, this is DAmico kind of working with some of the students, and you can see from the figurative work in the background, that this was a very traditional form of education in some regards. And in fact, again, just like as was happening in the kind of materials circulating around MoMA within the context of the curriculum at the People's Art Center as well, as students mastered kind of rudimentary skills, there were increasing kind of aspects of difficulty that were brought in when appropriate. This was also, though, and again, this is the kind of conflicting place of whither education and where does it happen. This was a very, kind of popular publication, as I just kind of alluded to, and so it really lays out a story of modernism that we've come to understand. And so education, this is to say, was happening in various ways for various constituencies and was being contested, and I think that's maybe something to kind of highlight as well, just the kind of central place of like, how should modern art be not only institutionalized, but how should it be understood? How should it be popularized? How should it be taught? Probably some of you know that Alfred Barr was actually the first art historian in this country to actually teach a class on what was then the contemporary art of the moment in which he was teaching it. Now, of course, we're at the end of a century where this is absolutely common, where it's, we take it for granted that we have students writing on living artists, as I did, as a lot of us in this room, have done, are doing. But this is, something that Barr really put in place through some of these pedagogical aims. And this, just to say very quickly, I think had a lot to do with the kind of incorporation of materials into the collection. And so to think for Ryman during these years in the 50s of what it meant for the collection to become a permanent collection during the years that he was actually working at the museum, and what that actually did, or kind of how that pressed on these other kind of experimental pedagogies, I think is something incredibly important. So you're looking at Barr's kind of famous diagram of the torpedo moving through time. And so when MoMA was and at first bringing works into its collection before it was a permanent collection, it was modeled on the Luxembourg, which was to divest works after the artist had been dead and a kind of consensus had formed around them. It would either go into, it's like kind of purgatory there, so it would either go into the provinces, never to be seen again, or it would ascend to the Louvre. And so they were using this as a kind of model that these contemporary artworks would be at MoMA for 50 years and then would potentially go to the Metropolitan or not. And so, as you can imagine, this was hard for procuring and maintaining donors, among other problems. And by 1953, the collection started becoming formalized. Sorry, I skipped a page. So the policy was unveiled in 1953. Not coincidentally, this announcement for the unveiling of the then permanent collection came after a building expansion that was completed by Philip Johnson in September of 1951, and as preparations for a commemorative 25th anniversary show were well underway. With this document in place then, the anniversary show could include 495 examples from the collection, as well as loaned or promised works. Interestingly, despite the policy kind of going into place in 1953, the collection was unresolved for many years. So even in 1957, very few pieces had become permanent, as Barr confirmed in a response to Hilton Kramer in Art News. And he kind of talks about, he says, of over 1,350 works in the museum's painting and sculpture collection, only 4 have so far been accepted for a permanent collection. The rest are still on trial, and these include all the recent accessions. We have often suggested that our guesses, 9 out of 10, would prove mistaken. So this is in 1957. So for me, this kind of uncertainty as to the prognostication of what not only will count as an artwork, but potentially historically significant or a good one, bears directly upon Ryman's experimentation and the kind of social horizon of his testing of each and every painting, not only whether it stands as a painting, but whether it will enter into a social contract where it will be perceived as such and then adjudicated on qualitative and other kinds of kinds of terms. So thus, DAmico's article, where he kind of performs this anxiety in the 1951 bulletin, allowed him to reaffirm the importance of his work at precisely the moment that he thought it had been subsumed by these other agencies within the institution, as well as rendered in kind of jeopardy because of these larger kind of social and political considerations within the Cold War rush to scientism. Always adaptive to contemporary pressures and the demands of a relatively young institution, educational services historically had been relinquished when rendered obsolete. And this was, in fact, exactly what happened with the Veterans Art Center. And so let me just show you, this is kind of one of his very long kind of documents detailing the founding of the War Veterans Center, which again became the template for the People's Art Center and then the template for the Education Department through the late 1960s. And I'm not going to go through this, but I did want to kind of put up the document so you could see just a few things. The kind of bullet points here I think are amazing. So, these are some of, he says, it's been founded in 1944 in an effort to do the following. It's based on these principles. So point 1, personal satisfaction. 2, individual instruction. 3, creativeness. 4, fundamentals. And then, there's these kind of amazing propagandistic images that attend the kind of description of the programs. Each veteran is different. They stress personal satisfaction. I want the fundamentals. So each of these is illustrating one of these kind of foundational points. I mean, this is not subtle in any way. This is my own. So this is creativity. It's like those horrible kind of like inspiration, like those corporate posters where it shows like a field or something. But then it talks about kind of what happens for the veterans. This is, complete PR. But I also want to point you to this last part, this really important thing, the reorientation to civilian life. So the short of this, because I know my time is very limited, to kind of round out the story, which is kind of in some ways where my new project picks up, is that MoMA had occupational therapists in residency in these years, which I think is kind of astounding. They were doing programs with the Red Cross. They were thinking very seriously about what the kind of mechanism of rehabilitation for American soldiers was to be. And I think this goes hand in hand with, Marcy, what you were talking about earlier, this idea of kind of rendering it a democratic space, a space that was not meant purely for the elite, that had a kind of agency in a larger construction of citizenry and the kind of sociability of makers and the kind of participatory democracy in some way that would suggest, which is, I think, a kind of fundamental Bauhaus principle as well, like, picking one color versus another color, or one material versus another, that kind of acting out of a subjective will, kind of circumscribed as it might be in a kind of material level, has potentially implications for other forms of organization and kind of social responsibility. But effectively what happened was that once other agencies started taking this on, MoMA didn't have the resources. They also realized that they were kind of wildly unprepared institutionally to do real kind of psychoanalytic work. Barr was very interested in Rorschachs, and I mean, there are kind of personal motivations here as well, but they just were not an institution that could actually be, they were not Bellevue, they were not other, institutions. So what did they do? Instead of shuttering all this, but literally rename it the People's Art Center. And so this was the kind of moment for me that is this conversion point between like the Ryman project and my new project, which was in front of me the whole time, which I talk about in literally like a sentence in passing in my Ryman book, and didn't really understand the implications of until I started thinking about this other kind of question of, kind of why have people believed that making art would do something for them, therapeutically or otherwise, in an American context in the last many years. And I think it's a really important thing to recover, because I think it has a lot to say about the kind of institutions that we think we understand, how they change often not in kind of, not in structure, but in name. And there's a really amazing moment in Lou Menand's book called The Metaphysical Club, where he talks about the legacy of the Civil War and the kind of particularity of the American government. And so far as, under most circumstances throughout history, once there's been a kind of civil revolution, of the kind of the Civil War, that you would have a reorganization of government, that you would have a restructuring of society that would be so fundamental. But in fact, that didn't happen here. And so part of this is an attempt to kind of think this structure of continuity across things that don't necessarily look alike, or kind of moments of historical linkages where we've not kind of previously seen them before. So maybe I will actually end with that, because I'm realizing I'm kind of running to an end. But I hope we can talk a lot more about this in the roundtable now. So thank you very much.